You know, it's probably one of the most famous stories ever told. A garden, a serpent, a piece of fruit that changes everything. But what if it's not just a simple story? What if it's actually this incredibly sophisticated explanation for, well, the entire human condition? That's what we're going to dig into today, a scholarly look at Genesis chapter 3. Okay, so let's get right into it. This isn't just some fairy tale about a garden. Based on the scholarship of Dr. Ted Hildebrandt, this is actually a really profound exploration of, well, why our world is the way it is. It all comes down to a single choice, a choice that kicked off this chain reaction of conflict, death, and, maybe surprisingly, a hidden little thread of hope. So the whole story really hinges on this one thing, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But what does that even mean, to know good and evil? Because it's really not as simple as just, learning some new information.
Well, to really get this, Dr. Hildebrandt breaks it down into two different kinds of knowledge. First, you've got objective knowledge. Think of it like this. It's knowing about evil from the outside. A doctor understands cancer, right? But they don't have to have cancer to understand it. The text suggests this is the kind of knowledge God has. But then, there's subjective knowledge, and this is totally different. This is knowing evil by experiencing it, by participating in it. And that's something God doesn't do.
So you can see this tragic progression, right? At first, humans are in this state of innocence. They only know good. Then the serpent shows up and introduces the idea of evil. Suddenly they have that objective knowledge. They know about it. But the moment they eat the fruit, that's when they cross the line. They gain subjective knowledge because they participate in it. And here's the real kicker. In trying to become like God by knowing good and evil, they actually went beyond God, internalizing the very thing he only knew from a distance. And well, that one single act sent shockwaves through everything. I mean, it had immediate, devastating consequences. It created these fractures in every single important relationship, their relationship with God, their relationship with each other, everything.
So what's the very first emotional fallout? Fear. That easy, open relationship, walking with God in the garden, it's just gone. And in its place is fear. And what does fear make you do? It makes you hide.
Next, you see the fracture spread to the human relationship. When God confronts them, what happens? The blame game begins. The man blames the woman, and get this, he doesn't just say the woman, he says, the woman you gave me. Ouch. Then she turns around and blames the serpent. It's like personal responsibility just evaporates, and all that's left is blame and conflict. And all of this really points to the core problem of the whole story: separation. There's this new, profound distance between humanity and God. People are hiding. God feels far away. That easy companionship is just totally shattered.
Okay, so let's just recap for a second. This new reality is defined by four big things: fear and shame, blame and conflict, separation from God, and for the first time, mortality, physical death. And these four consequences? They basically set the stage for the rest of the entire biblical story, which is all about trying to solve these problems.
So what happens next? The story lays out a series of what are called curses, but it's important to see these not just as random punishments. They're more like descriptions of what life is now like in this broken world. And, weirdly enough, hidden inside the very first curse is this little spark of hope. This first one is aimed right at the serpent. It basically says there's now going to be this constant conflict, right, between humanity, the woman's offspring, and evil. But then it ends with this really cryptic promise that a future descendant will come and deliver a crushing blow to the serpent's head, even though he'll get his own heel struck in the process. Theologians actually have a pretty cool name for this verse. They call it the proto-evangelium. It literally means first gospel or first good news. It's seen as the very first glimmer of hope in the whole Bible. A promise that this tragedy isn't the end of the story.
Okay, but then the text turns to the woman. And this is where we get a really famous and often really misunderstood line about her desire for her husband. So, what's that all about? What is this curse actually saying?
Okay, this is where a little bit of literary detective work is super helpful. Dr. Hildebrandt points out that the exact same, really rare Hebrew phrase for desire shows up just one chapter later. It's when God is warning Cain that sin desires to have you, like an animal waiting to pounce. In that context, desire clearly means a desire to control, to overpower. So if we apply that same meaning back here in chapter 3, the curse isn't about the woman wanting to be submissive. It's describing a new tragic power struggle that's now part of human relationships. So,
If the curse is this ongoing power struggle, then how do you fight against it? Well, according to this reading, you don't fight it by trying to grab more power. The way to reverse the curse is to reject that power dynamic completely. The solution isn't dominance, it's service.
Okay, so with all of that set up, the stage is now ready for the rest of the entire biblical narrative. You can basically see everything that comes next as this huge, epic story designed to answer the one central problem that started right here, in the garden.
And what is that problem? It's separation. There's a theological term for it, God absconditus, which just means the hidden God. Humanity isn't walking with God anymore, they're hiding from a God that now feels distant, far away.
And if that's the problem, the solution becomes the driving theme of everything that follows. Emmanuel. It means God with us. The entire rest of the story is about God closing that distance, step by step, to restore that presence.
And you can see this journey playing out across the whole story. First, there's the tabernacle, this mobile tent where God's presence lives right in the middle of the people as they wander. Then it gets more permanent with the temple in Jerusalem. In the New Testament, it becomes incredibly personal with Jesus, literally, God with us in the flesh. And the end goal of the whole thing? A complete return to that garden state, where humanity is finally and forever with God again.
And that really leaves us with a powerful final thought, doesn't it? If this ancient story sets up this huge cosmic drama about overcoming separation from God, it also sets up a deeply personal one for us. It suggests that whenever we fight against blame, whenever we try to solve conflict, whenever we choose connection over fear, we're not just doing a nice thing. We're actually taking part in the central story, the grand project of what it means to be human.